Good morning, BBC. It's me, David Livy, and I'm glad to be here with you this morning. I'm blessed to bring God's word to you. And as we come to the closing in our series of Broken Faith, I believe we will see God's word speak into our hearts so that our faith may go from broken to unbroken. But before we get to that idea or that concept, I want to share a story from my past. I'm sure you have heard many great excuses in your time. As someone who's been involved in ministry and in schools, I've heard some phenomenal excuses given to me by parents, by kids, by a number of people. But one of the best excuses I ever heard was from a little girl that she gave to my friend, a teacher. She was going to do a sports day and she didn't really want to do it. And she was dressed in her school clothes. She wasn't dressed for sports. And she brought him this note, as kids were supposed to. Bring a note from your parents that you can't be involved. And as my friend took this note, it was all crumpled up, which is not unusual for kids. You know, our kids were with notes, they crumpled it up. And he uncrumpled it, and as he uncrumpled, he saw that it was dirty and it was smudgy, like someone's hands had been all over it. It had been torn from the corner of a book. And the note read as such: Katie's sick, signed Mom. And when I mean Mom, she literally wrote Mom on that. That was her excuse. That was what she thought would be good enough to get her out of that sports day. Which sounds ridiculous, but do we not do the exact same thing? Our excuse is not that lame excuse as well often in our lives. When we don't want to do something or we don't want to serve someone, the excuse that we try to think up is just really not good enough because ultimately that excuse shouldn't exist in the first place. As we have been going through this series of broken faith, we have covered the idea that we need to remember God's faithfulness, because as we remember a God who is true and a God who provides, it helps repair our faith. And as we remember the idea of our commitment as well, and what we've committed to God, that also helps repair our faith. But lastly in this series, we need to see that our faith needs to be active. Our faith requires deeds. Our faith requires service in order for it to be truly unbroken. A faith that is fulfilling to us, a faith that is satisfying to us, a faith that brings us joy and hope requires us to be active. But so often in our lives, we have gone away from service. We have gone away from that idea of helping others because of what it costs. And that is what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at these two ideas of suffering and serving. Suffering and serving are our 2 points as we look at this main idea that we need to serve in order for our faith to be unbroken. Go with me to the text today of Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10 and verse 32. And once again, we see Jesus walking here. And he says, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. We'll stop there for the moment. Let's first look at Jesus here as we look at the concept of suffering and Jesus knowing his death. Right at the beginning of this passage, it says they're going towards the city. They're going to Jerusalem. And people are in awe of Jesus, but they are afraid. And the reason they're afraid is because the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests are there waiting for them, waiting for Jesus. They know that they want Jesus gone. And they're followers of Jesus, so they are afraid. But Jesus continues to go towards that city, knowing what is coming. In fact, it says here in the passage, he then tells them what is about to take place, that he is going to suffer, and that suffering is incredible. That suffering is him being mocked and spat on and flogged and killed. He predicts this before it even takes place. Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever been on the road and you're driving and you come to a bridge and you need to get on the highway, but you cross the bridge first? And as you cross the bridge, I imagine all of you take a look at where you're about to go. You take a look at the highway. And as you look at that highway, you just see a traffic jam. Traffic all the way. And this dread sits in your stomach. But the problem is you have to get on the highway. That's the only way you're going to get to where you're going. And so you slowly take that off-ramp turn, going around the circle, knowing what's coming up. Dread in front of you. Now take that and times that by thousands, because Jesus knows what is coming for him. He knows the pain. He knows what he is going to suffer, and yet doesn't take a different route, sticks on that on-ramp and continues to go towards it. Why would Jesus do this? Well, it tells us in the passage right at the end, in verse 45, it says this, in verse 10, chapter 10 of verse 45, it says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus Christ came to give his life for us. We're going to get into that idea of service a little bit later, but once again, notice Jesus came to serve us, to suffer for us. So my question to you, first off, is, are you better than Jesus? Now that may sound like a strange question, but it's a real important question. Because when it comes to suffering, we think, well, I don't want to suffer. Surely I'm good enough not to suffer. But remember Jesus Christ here. Jesus Christ is perfect man. Jesus Christ is God incarnate. And yet Jesus Christ still suffers. And he suffers for us. He serves us. What is our response often when it comes to suffering? What happens to us when we are to go serve others and knowing that suffering is about to come? What happens to us when suffering is just around the corner? Do we go towards it or do we run away? Our natural response is to run away from that suffering. Now, I'm not saying you should seek out suffering, but whenever there is suffering around us, we run away. And I hate using that word natural because natural is the incorrect word. It should be sinful. When it comes to the concept of serving and suffering, yes, suffering is going to come because that is what Jesus has predicted for himself and for us. We should not run away. Our natural response, is often in these lives of either fight or flight. Fight that problem or run away from that problem is how we are to respond often in our lives. And I don't know about you, but for me, I'm really good at the running away. But for Jesus Christ, he asks us to do neither. He asks us neither to fight or to flight, but rather to stand still in the middle and take it so that we may serve others well, just like he did. That is the call for us. But our problem when it comes to serving and when it comes to suffering is that we misunderstand suffering. We don't really truly grasp the concept. We're not alone in this. The disciples are the same as we see from this very passage. These are people who think, well, I'm able to take the suffering that Jesus is going to take. But it's often because we have this problem just like the disciples, is that we have a karmic understanding of suffering, whereas Jesus understands it like this. He suffers not despite his righteousness, but because of it. We think if I just do enough good in my Christian life, if I just serve enough, then everything will be okay. Everything will be fine. But actually, it's the opposite. If you serve and do good works in this life as a Christian, what often comes with it is suffering. But we are not people who believe in karma, but one of grace. We are people who are to go after this idea of service despite the suffering. But as I have just said, we're not alone in this. The disciples, when Jesus presents the concept of suffering, say this in verse 39. They say, we are able. We are able to take that suffering that you present to us. But are they really? Are they really able to do it? Remember what happened at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Where were the disciples? These are the people that said, we are able to take the suffering that you're presenting to us, Jesus. But where were they? Were they at the right and left of Jesus? No, the disciples were not even there. Who was at the right and left of Jesus? It was the thieves. It should have been Peter and James and the others suffering there along with their Messiah, along with the one that they had followed for their entire lives up until this point, and yet they are not. Because they have a misunderstanding of suffering just like us. We must realize that this Christian life, this Christian faith will have suffering. In fact, if your Christian faith doesn't have suffering, you should be asking the question, why doesn't it? Is it a time of reprieve that Christ is giving you? Or does your life just not have any examples of Christianity in it? Suffering happens in this Christian life. But as we think about that, we go, well, in order to have our unbroken faith, in order to be a person who truly serves, if that means I'm going to suffer, then, I'd rather take the alternative. I'd rather not do that. Let me just do my own thing. Let me just sit in the pews. Let me just listen. Let me put the least possible work into my faith, because at least then I won't get suffering, if that's what you're saying to me, David. Yet you may not be suffering in your life, but what type of faith is that? That is a faith that doesn't have anything within it. That is a faith that doesn't have true hope and peace and joy in it. And in fact, as you think of yourself as a person, it reminds me of those movies. My favorite movies to watch are these movies about war, these historical war pieces. And in every one of those movies, there's always two types of people. There's the hero, the ordinary man, running into battle, running across the line towards the enemy, knowing his purpose and his goal. And the other person is the coward, sitting in his hole, doing nothing, scared of what is about to take place. And every time I walk out of those movies, I'm inspired, and I'm sure you are as well. And I'm sure as you walk out of those movies, you go, I want to be the hero. In fact, as you think of the coward, you're probably frustrated. This person has possibly even caused the death of others in that movie. I am telling you this morning that if your faith is not active, if your faith is forever broken, you are more like that coward and less like that hero. Your faith needs to move and strive towards a goal. And as your faith does that, it is unbroken and reaps massive reward. Notice in that story of war, what is the end result for the hero and what is the end result for the coward? Both will die. But what happens after? What does it look like for both of them after? What is the reward of the hero as people remember him and the reward of the coward? As we meet Christ today, yes, both will meet Christ as soldiers, but what does this person hear and what does this person hear? We are called to serve despite suffering. We are called to serve, and as we serve, our faith blossoms. And I want you to see that this morning as we look at the way in which people are meant to serve. Let's think about the disciples here. In the text, we see that James and John ask to be at the teacher's right and left. Important question for them. They want to sit there with him. Now, it's good what they say. They call him teacher. They recognize his authority. And they also recognize that he is king, that they want to sit at his right and left. And the right and left are places of authority and honor. Wonderful things. And it's not just them that want this. It's the rest of the disciples, because at the end, in verse 41, when it says the 10 heard this and they became to be indignant about James and John, it's not because of the question they asked, is that James and John would ask it thinking that they are better than them, because Peter and the rest also want that. Why would James and John ask this? Well, they're part of the disciples. They were at the transfiguration. They think that they are important. But they've missed the idea. Because look at Jesus' response and look at how Jesus models the idea of serving. From verse 42, chapter 10. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." The disciples wanted to be great. They wanted to have authority. And I imagine for each one of you this morning, you also want to be great. But as Jesus puts it, in order to have this greatness one day, what we need to do in this life is to be a slave to all. In order for the disciples to be first among the disciples, they have to serve all. In order for us in this church to be great in this church, it's to serve all, to be a slave to all. And Jesus has been the very example to this. Who did Jesus serve in his life? He served the sick, the lepers, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. He served them all and was a slave to them all. Jesus is the perfect depiction of what true faith looks like, because his faith has action despite the suffering that he will have. We need to have the exact same. We need to start becoming like this, have this view of service. And I know it's a struggle. In fact, the disciples struggled with this very same idea. In the Gospels, the disciples fail. And even as we've gone through the story, we have seen each week that the disciples continuously fail. But in the book of Acts, we see a change. The disciples become like Jesus. They become slaves to all and serve all, even when they suffer. We are called to do the same. But let's be honest with each other this morning. At the beginning of today's sermon, I spoke about excuses. Right now, where you are sitting, I want you to think about the excuses you have given in your life to service. The excuses you have given when it comes to helping someone else. And yes, I know sometimes we have valid excuses, but I really want you to think about them. Is every single excuse you have given valid? Really discern if they are. And a good way to discern them is in this way. Would Jesus have used those same excuses? Would Jesus have gone, I want to go to the cross, but I just need to take some time to find out who the real Jesus is. Let me just take time for myself. And when I find out that, then I'll go serve. Would it be the idea of, I really want to go help this widow, as Jesus would have said, but I'm really busy right now. There's just so many other things going on. When I have time, I'll go help that widow. Oh, I'd really like to come serve in this church, but you know what? There's this guy, Peter and John there, they're really weird and difficult people. When they're gone, I'll come serve and help out there. Would Jesus say those things? No. It's ridiculous to even think that idea. Because once again, for Jesus, his faith has action despite the suffering that he may have. But once again, we sit there and we go, but when I serve, and even if we believe that service is good for our faith, but when I serve, there is a cost. Let's truly analyze those costs this morning. Let's really be honest with them. Often one of the costs we may think is time. We think, it's for me to serve at the church or for me to help someone else out in order to show action in my faith. It's going to cost me time. I've heard that excuse. I've given that excuse myself. And yet, as if I truly analyze time, I think about the amount of time I spend watching Arsenal Football Club. I spend at least 2 hours a week watching this football club that brings me immense suffering every single week, and yet I toil through it, and I don't see it as a waste of time, and that gives me absolutely nothing. And yet I say to others, I don't have enough time to serve? Truly analyze it in your life. Are you saying that each week you don't have time to help serve someone else? But even as we think about that, what are we really saying in the idea of it costing me? It's just costing me an hour. That's not even the suffering that Jesus is speaking about here. The suffering that he is speaking about with time is the idea that you really give over your life to someone to serve them. You help them not just on one day of the week, you help them week after week after week. And yes, that costs you a lot, but imagine the result afterwards. Life's changed, yours and the person you've served. Imagine the joy and the peace you get out of that. Imagine what your faith will look like after that. Another cost that we may say is suffering. But once again, let's truly analyze that. Because we've often used this excuse that, man, it's really hard for me to get to church or to help others to serve. Are we really being honest with ourselves? Is it really that hard to wake up half an hour earlier for church to get there? Is it really too difficult to power through the cold in the morning? Is that the suffering that we're speaking about when it comes to service? And yes, I sat there in bed going, really, do I have to wake up this morning to help serve others? But once again, that's not the suffering that Jesus is speaking about here. The suffering that he is talking about here when you service is what's cost people lives. It's cost them pain. It's cost them freedom. And you know what's amazing when I read the stories of those people? Every single time when they speak about their service, they speak about the joy and the love and the hope that they have. They don't regret their service. They wish they didn't have to suffer, but at no point do they regret it because it's ingrained with their faith. Often what people struggle with is loss of relationship as they think about service. They think about, well, one of the ways in which I serve others is by sharing the gospel. If I share the gospel this morning with someone, maybe they won't like me as much. We think about friends, families, and others. We think as I share it, it's going to cost me. But once again, truly analyze that. When has it truly cost you that relationship? Sometimes it's made it awkward, but is that enough of an excuse to not share the gospel? But now let's really look at it. Imagine for a moment if you shared the gospel with someone and they completely disowned you. That loss would be heart-wrenching. However, also note that the last thing that you would have said to them is the most important thing you could ever tell them. You would have told them something that is life-giving. You would have told them something that would save them for eternity. Does that loss match what you could possibly gain? Not at all. Our faith requires us to serve. And so if you're sitting there this morning going, my faith is broken, I don't know if I can believe God's going to come to my aid. I don't know if I'm able to get through this season or through this time or through these difficulties, whatever they are. The answer to that is not to pull away and stop serving, but rather to move in, to serve even more, to connect with people more. Not that that will mean you'll have less suffering, but it gives your faith purpose and makes your faith alive. As we remember that God is faithful and know that He is trustworthy, and as we remember our commitment and then apply that into serving others, we then have a faith that is not only unbroken, but is growth and beautiful. And is a faith that, as we come to this passage, is a faith on mission. Because this is what Jesus Christ is speaking about here. His mission to save the world, even if it costs Him His life. He asks of His disciples to take of this cup as well. And we are asked to take of this cup. And it may cost us, but remember what you gain. When you look at people with strong faith who serve well, do you ever think, oh, shame, I wish they had more? Rather, you look at them, you go, I want some of that. Let me have some of that. Let your faith have service. And what's even more beautiful than that is one day when we see Jesus Christ again, and preachers use this all the time, it's a cliche, but there's something beautiful about this idea that when we meet Christ one day and He looks at us and He goes, well done, my good and faithful servant. You used your faith well. That is what we should long for. And so this morning, as you sit there, I'm not asking you to get to the end of the road straight away, but take that first step. Maybe that first step this morning for you is to just go serve in one ministry, to give an hour once every 2 weeks or once a month even. Just take that first step that your faith may have service as well attached to it. And as you take that first step, afterwards take the next step and watch your faith grow and watch your faith help you and watch how maybe not your difficulties disappear, but how you are able to view your difficulties differently and how you will be satisfied in this life. Let me pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the wonderful faith that you have given us. I pray that we would use that faith to serve others, to serve your glory. Father, I pray for forgiveness for the many of us, for how often we have used terrible excuses to get out of serving you, to get out of serving others, because we have become lazy, or because we have become selfish, or because even just as we look at the world encroaching on us, we have struggled. I pray, Father, that we would look against that we would move out and serve others, whether it's by sharing your gospel, Father, whether it's by helping others in need. Help us to serve, Father. Help unbreak our faith, that it may be strong, that it may be a faith that moves mountains, Father. Thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, that he did not waver in his faith, but even went to the cross to die for us. And in his name, and by the power of your Holy Spirit, amen.